He's going to try and break it, I think, within the next 6 weeks to 3 months. And oh boy, if he doesn't get a decisive victory by then, I think he will be in quite a difficult position.
Hi and welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heapy and I'm joined on this episode by Robert Fox, the defence editor of the Evening Standard. Robert last joined us on Superpowers back in July when we had a fantastic conversation about Putin's ambitions in the Arctic, and it's well worth revisiting that episode for two reasons. Firstly, for the brilliance of Robert's insight into Putin's plans for the High North, a really strategically important region in the world. And frankly, for all that has changed since last July, nothing changes about the commentary that Robert offered then, and it's well worth watching. But it's also worth rewatching that episode to realise how just 9 months ago, the way that the world would be now, in the wake of Trump returning to the White House and all that he has changed for good and bad over the last few months, we are in a territory that I don't think we could have possibly imagined. So, Robert, whilst everybody else is thinking about the future of global trade after Liberation Day this week and the big shock to the global trading system that has caused, I thought that we might go back and just consider what this all actually means for Putin, Ukraine, and the peace deal there. Really keen to get your insights into exactly how that is panning out and whether or not anything that Trump is intending is likely to succeed. But also just to quickly touch on Iran, China, North Korea, who must all be sitting there quietly rubbing their hands with glee as the world becomes distracted, turning in on itself, and increasingly taking their eye off whatever the malign ambitions might be of those crink actors. So Robert, welcome back. Lots to discuss. Let's start with Putin, Ukraine, and the peace deal. Give us your sense of where things are at.
I wonder whether Putin reads St. Augustine, who famously said, "Make me chaste, give up sex, but not too soon." Putin is not giving up war too soon. There's been a lot of talk. It's very interesting how it goes round in a circle and it comes back to a fundamental. And it's a fundamental that's generally spouted by Lavrov and indeed his deputy. And it's this: we want to look at what we consider the root causes of this conflict with and about Ukraine. It's not just removing the neo-Nazi puppet regime, as they call Zelensky in Kiev. It is really rolling back the influence, malign influence, as they see it, of NATO and the NATO allies, and going back to a status quo ante. And if that sounds like verbiage, it's probably true, because it's la la land. It's not really so. And I think that this is actually, with Trump as he becomes increasingly eccentric, and indeed with Putin, they're referring to a narrative of their two countries' history, which is fantasy more than fact. The great Russia, the great central power, make America great again. It's very much like the Monroe Doctrine, isn't it? We're almost going back to the 19th century there. And I think that in between, and that's why I know that this is about the superpowers, but it's the powers below, is how do you, since the big guys have been throwing all the bricks out of the toy box, how do you put them back together again? And that is very, very much a preoccupation of, I think, 2 or 3 or 4 of the crucial European allies, of which we have to say, and I'm not putting them in any order, France, Britain, Germany, and curiously, even where Russia is concerned, Italy, because Italy has a particular take. And they've got to try and make sense of this. And can I just say, I know we hadn't intended at the outset to talk about it. I think it's something that you must be very interested in. The Strategic Defence Review is really very, very difficult, because the more and more that I look at it, and they've been very tight about saying what's in it, but I know what's around it and what created it, they've got very, very limited room for manoeuvre. It is quite a mess. But back to Russia. Russia, yes, We know what Putin wants also practically. He wants sanctions lifted. He wants his favorite bank, very big bank, to join the SWIFT program again, to get agri-products, that includes fertilizers, out through the Black Sea and not to be sanctioned, because it's very, very important for Russia, because they're losing the geopolitical south with this, namely who they've fed, who they've helped, particularly in Africa. But he's also concentrating on the Central Front, the line of contact, as I know you particularly would appreciate. He's trying to use mass. He's called up another 130,000 for reserve duties. Every commentator is absolutely clear that is for the Ukraine front. And he's going to try and break it, I think, within the next 6 weeks to 3 months. And oh boy, if he doesn't get a decisive victory by then, I think he will be in quite a difficult position, because I think the economy is saying you can't go through another winter running at this rate on a total war economy.
Fascinating. So, Robert, what I think you're describing there is quite an interesting sequence of events, but not necessarily the one that most people would think is imminent. Most people think that some sort of deal is in the offing. You actually think that Putin is about to go on the offensive. You think, I'm reading between the lines, therefore, that all of his engagement with Trump is a smokescreen, it's token, it's not meant, and that it perhaps buys him time to plan this offensive. But if he's unsuccessful in that offensive, you think that that is then the strategic culmination of Russia's effort, and so it's an all or nothing play for Putin. Have I understood you right there?
That's a very fair inference, but I perhaps put it in a very confused way. But it's very interesting how both Putin and Trump, and they see it in a different way, look at the military instrument. Putin has had a shock, because this thing should have been over as of February 2022. It should have been over within weeks, and it's still going on. And the fact is that it's also, it seems, the great advantage which he's building on. He's got 1.5 million underarms altogether, 650,000 roughly committed to the battlefront, to corps, all the way around, including the reserves and depth, the logistical bases. He should be able to make more of it. But what is he going to do if the thing goes into stalemate, if it becomes a frozen conflict, and he's got 1.5 million active underarms? It is an acute situation for Russia. The thing I hope that we come into in this discussion in a very big way, demography, demographic wintering is really beginning to hit right across the piece, all the way through from Rachel Reeves' spring statement. We have an aging population whose welfare, as you know very well, we cannot afford in the medium to long term on the present models. Russia has a declining population, nothing like as dramatic as that of China, by the way, something that is being largely missed, but it's a population which is not in good condition health-wise. But also, if you're going to play the demographic game, and this is why we are coming to a culminating point in the Ukraine conflict, is that the situation is dreadful for Ukraine. It's lost about 8 million. By that I mean exiles, refugees, you name it, from a country of about 44 million, and it has one of the lowest fertility rates now currently being registered. It's when you need a level of 2.1 per couple per breeding woman to keep a stable population. It's 1.1 in Ukraine, and it's even below Russia, which is 1.4. And I think that this is the big situation where we're looking at a really long-term question, which is becoming more and more imminent, but we avoid it. I mean, there are dreadful prospects, particularly when you put it in with changing environment, climate change, whatever you call it, and the whole migration and movement of people story. I think in the new management jargon speech, wonderful, wonderfully attractive, grim concept. It's called a black jellyfish. We've had black swans, we've had grey rhinos, the big thing in the room which is coming at you, but you try and ignore. The black jellyfish is the really dreadful long-term solution. You just pretend it's going to go away. It's so awful. I cannot contemplate it. It needs an absolutely dramatic change of direction in the way that we move. So let's put our hands over our eyes, ears, and mouth, if you possibly can, and for it to go away. I think it is the big crisis of the West. Of the world at the moment.
Robert, you're throwing out breadcrumbs all over the place for me to follow, and we risk making this a sort of telethon to map the length of that senator who spoke for 25 hours in Congress this week.
I have to say, very quickly, and James, it's worth talking about some of this because very little of it is getting into the public debate.
Well, I agree, and I want to try and pull some of it together because, again, I mean, you three things I think you've thrown in that are all really interesting in and of themselves, but connect in quite an interesting way. So firstly, you pointed out that America seeks to reprioritize around its own internal economic prosperity, and if there is a foreign policy, it is orientated around a competition with China and the Pacific. So therefore, and you also illuminated how Putin similarly has a sense of his sphere, that Russia is a superpower and that Russia wants to pursue its own foreign policy. But the question you posed is whether the next tier down of powers, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Australia, are they capable of picking up the slack and standing up for a world order that is being challenged by Putin and Xi and others without America? And you asked a question about the sort of financial resource that the UK MOD has, but that is a situation I think that even with the debt brake being removed is matched in Germany. It's certainly matched in France and Italy. So I think that's a really interesting question to ask. You also then threw in the changing demography. That brings with it challenges for the public finances for all developed Western democracies. It's ever harder to move money from health and social security into defense and physical security. So that connects with your point about, do Britain and the other powers below the superpowers have the ability to do this? Is it politically tenable? And the danger is that your black jellyfish analogy is exactly what ends up happening, that we talk a good game about the urgency of the moment. We talk a good game about this being the most dangerous moment in Euro-Atlantic security for generations. And yet we're just not able and or willing to do anything about it. And in that case, people like Putin end up getting to do almost as they wish, but qualified by your excellent insight into just how precarious the Russian demography is and the Russian economy, and actually whether he can afford to keep doing it too. So we could be in a world where we all collapse into a heap of exhaustion, or, and I think this is the question I'd like you to think on, is this not, when the geopolitical stakes are this high, do countries just get on with their with being aggressive in spite of those economic and demographic realities? So, are we just in a time where aggression will define the age, even if actually the foundations on which that aggression should be based aren't there?
Yes, we were talking about apprehension and how we see it, and I think you're absolutely right. This is the difference between the West, and particularly the European West, where democracy really does mean something, but it does have rather a difficult spin, since we're now in title of work in progress. We're in a new age of anxiety. And it's very interesting how concerned we are, how we perceive our electorates. I'm not talking about in America. I'm talking particularly that, the way the Labour government says, for instance, oh, or its supporters and its critics say, oh, but it's not in the manifesto. I mean, are we going to be ruled, just to be thinking, this is slightly left field, typical, I'm going all over the place, but are we going to be ruled in the UK in terms of policy about what was in the manifesto, even though circumstances have changed absolutely radically, or what the OBR thinks? Forecasters and think tanks, it's all gone out of kilter. And again, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring up a historical analogy. We've had poor old St. Augustine of Hippo. But I think that this is what I call, and nobody's going to commission an article for me about it, but it's the Machiavelli moment. When Machiavelli wrote this dreadful handbook for, it frightened Christendom, Counter-Reformation, Reformation Europe in saying, things are so bad, things are really about to hit the wall or have hit the wall. You've got to throw the old rules out. Yes, you can have morals and precepts and good conduct and so on, but I've got to give you a few questions. And Machiavelli's The Prince is a book, it's a handbook, not about answers at all, but it's about the appropriate questions. No wonder Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, loved it so much, wrote a very good book about what he thought Machiavelli was up to. This very strange man, he said, it's all about what you have to think about when you are in a crisis. And it's not only thinking out of the box, you may have to find entirely new boxes. I think looking at the string of meetings of foreign ministers and heads of government and defense ministers, and then the big NATO summit throughout Europe, that's what they're doing. They're not thinking in new enough categories for the situation as to where we are and what we can do. I mean, the kind of thing I think that Britain is doing, and I know you've been very close to it, but I cannot for the life of me, seeing the crisis continuing in Central Europe and the potential very serious confrontation with Iran coming up, what is the UK doing, sending a carrier group very thinly armed, halfway across the world to the Pacific? And that shows you, and I think that that is a failure of thinking. That is a failure. Sorry, I'm all over the place, but I am trying to say you are not focusing on the Machiavelli moment. Machiavelli in 1512 said, it's all fallen apart. It's terrible. I was going to use a very rude word to say it is real. And we've got to do something about it. So, O king, and I don't like kings, I don't like princes because I'm a Republican, why don't you think about this? Is it better to be feared or loved? Yeah, you can do what, but you can't be feared all the time if you totally alienate the people. And I think that that's what both Trump and Putin are facing too, if they lose their base at any time. And I think within 2 years, but not immediately, in both cases, it's entirely possible.
Well, I'm tempted. There's the danger this reverses quickly, and I end up answering your questions. I agree with you, and there are plenty, I think, around NATO that agree with you that it's a curious thing for the UK to project hard power into the Indo-Pacific at a time of acute danger in the Euro-Atlantic. I guess that the argument that they would deploy, that's the Royal Navy and the UK MOD, is firstly that this is also a time when the UK needs to be, if the transatlantic relationship is more fragile than it's been for a long time, really good moment to reconnect with the world beyond Suez, where there's real opportunity and affinity with the UK. But also, I think that the debate that rages within the UK Defence Review around whether the UK should orientate itself as a European power focused pretty much exclusively on the security of the Euro-Atlantic and NATO, or whether the UK is a global power and the future of the transatlantic relationship relies on the UK being an ally of America's in the Pacific as well, is actually a really good debate. And frankly, those who argue either way tend to be just trying to justify their version of how they want defence spending and the destruction of our armed forces to go. The conversations I've had in Washington are pretty inconclusive. Some say just the UK and France concentrate on the Euro-Atlantic, let us free up some resource for the Pacific. Others say that they want to see the Europeans in the Pacific standing up for the rules-based system and freedom of navigation, and standing up against Chinese aggression as the Americans see it. But to drag us back, I'm just your point about this is a moment for out of the box solutions. This is a moment to dig out your copy of the prince and to sort of consider what constitutes fortune. I Are the US negotiating team doing something that is incredibly strategic, out of the box, and Machiavellian, or are they just blowing in the wind and reacting to events?
The jury's out, and I don't want to be impolite, but I'm quite worried about the activities. There's suddenly we hear a lot of emphasis on the discussions between Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Dmitriev, and these are old business buddies, and it's back to Trump square one. Everything is a business deal, the art of the deal. Well, it's not. It's not a real estate transaction, and in fact, if you see the terms in which Dmitriev, he said, "Oh, we had very positive discussions." I'm talking about in the last 36 hours. He's in the United States saying, "Oh, we discussed minerals. By the way, that is generational to get the minerals out, even in Ukraine. They're not available, and particularly in Siberia, where they're talking about JVs, Russian." American companies doing it, and the Arctic. I mean, this is part of the Greenland debate. You know, that you could say all those lovely minerals. It's actually commercially idiotic at the moment, given the cost of doing that. So what I'm trying to illustrate with that is that kind of discussion. It's so remote from what is happening actually now, is what you have to deliver. So that is what worries me about your view of suggesting, oh, there might be some great Machiavellian grand design behind this. This is the new strategy. This is actually how America first really works. I'm quite skeptical about that, because for me, particularly, you know, even the discussions that we got from the signal leak to Jeff Goldberg of the Atlantic, the famous targeting of the Houthis. It's all far too casual. You know, that have we got America the unreliable, or America the unpredictable? No, we have to put it down. We've got America that's totally erratic. That is one thing after another, and that's very difficult when you've got a senior partner like that. You've got a lot of commentary in the transatlantic, particularly Europhile American press say, you know, now it's time for Europe to step up. Well, the number of times you and I in our lifetime have heard about it being the time for Europe to step up. I think it's a time for cool heads. I think it's the kind of thing where I hope there's a lot of discussion going on, working from first principles, where they're not discussing it openly. But I hope there's some real thinking going on there. And I hope there's some real depth thinking going on about China, because China is roaring ahead. It's doing terribly well with its military weaponry and so on. Put that to one side. But with technology, it seems to be embracing quantum. It seems to be getting ahead with what is happening with AI. But I was looking at the weekend at a projection that in under 100 years, the population of China is going to halve. And think of the stress that that's going to produce. And very few people are talking about it, to the extent that I have a colleague, he should be nameless because I'm going to be somewhat, says he pompously, disparaging, a colleague on The Economist who really knows China. Said, oh, demography doesn't count. I said, you bet it does, because it produces some very, very unexpected results. I mean, it produced revolution across Europe when the population collapsed in the Black Death, and we've had equivalents of the Black Death all the way through as to what's happening. And one of the things psychologically, I think in Britain, which is acute at the moment, is the effect of COVID, curiously. Now, if you go to a NATO planning meeting, what are we going to do next? What sort of corps, brigades, rapid reaction forces we can produce? You ain't going to get too much discussion about the problem of resilience that we can see through the COVID crisis. But for goodness sake, I do hope somebody is thinking about it.
Well, I hope that they are too.
Yeah.
I know that in the UK, it was definitely being thought of when I was in the MOD, and I'd be amazed if it's not a really important part of the defence review now.
Well, yeah, recruiting, for example.
Well, exactly. And look, let's be clear. The UK military, just like many other Western militaries, is struggling to recruit. There's all sorts of interesting
Including the
reasons.
US.
Sorry?
Including the US, which people...
Well, so yes, although on last week's episode of Superpowers, I asked Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army in Europe, what he thought the answer was to this struggle that Western militaries were having to fill their ranks, and was it reflective of a disconnection between armies and the societies they serve, and society and the army that it recruits from? And he pointed out that actually America had hit its recruiting target for the army last year, and he focused very much on the offer around an education that the US Army makes. That's very different to the British Army.
I'm not telling you your job, but did you ask him what happens when you turn off the migration tap in the US?
Well, I didn't, Robert, which is a mistake. We should get him on again, and you and I can.
Because it is absolutely essential.
Although poor Ben would rightly say it's not really his beat anymore. He was offering commentary rather than as an empowered decision maker in his own right. But look, there is a really interesting thing in this meander through a whole load of issues, which is that Europe hasn't had to consider a genuinely existential challenge for generations. When we were last confronted with it, our strategic resilience was an essential part of government policymaking, central to almost everything. How would the nation survive? How would the nation generate a second and third echelon to add to what was already a first echelon of forces that was massively bigger and better resourced than the first echelon we have now? All across Europe, nations were similarly geared around that existential challenge. And your point that the demographics are declining, the impulse in society to fight and to serve within the armed forces looks, from polling that we've seen recently, to be reduced. Although I wonder whether, if the moment actually comes of existential challenge, all of that sort of anxiety floats away and people are ready to fight just as their grandfathers and great grandfathers had been generations beforehand. But I do think it is a challenge that is that must be answered in the Strategic Defence Review, and other European nations need to do likewise.
That's what makes, I think, the role of Fiona Hill in the Strategic Defence Review absolutely critical. And it's something new, and it's what will be different, I think. I understand. Well, I hope it'll be different from what we had in what was, as an exercise, very good in '98, and indeed the ones that were done when you were in office. I mean, it was professional. It's the way you do a defence review. But you're absolutely right, because it's the resilience issue. And when you have this sense in the population, I think, which we're talking about, of fragmentation and alienation, so you don't come to the common cause. And also you and I, in our very sort of linear way, are actually putting a very difficult proposition. It's going to be the challenge, the threat is going to be extremely complex, because it's not going to be bombs, bullets, and heavy metal necessarily. It's going to be all kinds of other things, including, are we resilient enough to handle complex things, or a perfect storm, say, of natural disasters, a pandemic, weird weather, all coming in quick succession or possibly at the same time. This is where we have excellent thinkers. That Kate Bingham, I instance, said this was the thing that she thought we had to address in the wash-up, in the looking into COVID. And she said, I'm not entirely sure that we're ready for it. We can be prepared, and we should be prepared. Now, somebody you and I knew very well, alas no longer with us, was Mike Jackson. And when Mike Jackson was Commander-in-Chief, I think he may have still have been serving, he had to take, that is Commander-in-Chief of the Ground Forces, he had to take charge and an extraordinary exercise of the foot and mouth pandemic, which became nationwide. Now, I wished when they were looking at COVID, when they were preparing for it, they'd looked at Mike's haul down from that, which is absolutely exemplary. And it said, it's go in early, go quickly, and bring all the resources to bear across disciplines, across branches that you can. There was, very famously, you may remember, a brigadier of one of the districts in the Northwest, happily, and he was from a farming background, Alex Birtwistle, who knew how to do this. Now, funny enough, at the same time, it was smaller and more concentrated, but difficult. The Dutch had an outbreak, and they moved in everything from the National Fire Brigade to deal with. It was an animal pandemic, and we've got to look at animal pandemics because zoonotics, things that move across species, are a real worry. It's move in early, move quickly, and have a very clear line of command. It's that clarity of thinking. It sounds simplistic. It's not what I'm getting at the moment from these sort of burble think tanks, where you have very learned papers and a complete massacre of the English language. You know, that they're communicating with themselves, I feel fine and sure, but they're not communicating with a public or an audience outside, which is essential. So we've got traditional tools. We know there are real and present dangers. Let's not say threats. But we know we shouldn't address them in the same old way because the context is so different. Hence, and how dangerous it is, fortune, necessity, it's the Machiavellian moment.
I can see I can see a wonderful article that somebody needs to commission you to write quite urgently. I think that the characteristic that you're describing in your analysis of the foot and mouth outbreak and the national UK response to that, to COVID, the characteristic you're describing is the willingness and the capacity to immediately mobilize all levers of the state to respond to the crisis. And what I think is really interesting is that if you believe that there is a major war potentially coming within the next 5 years, be that in the Pacific or in the Euro-Atlantic or both, and that therefore the UK, France, Germany, the US, Australia, Japan, America, Canada will find themselves in a moment where they face genuine existential threat, you might then look at this period of policy making that is very seized on the need for defence spending, but that is actually quite a narrow front on which to policy make when the threat is as great as it may be. And the point that you so brilliantly make is that if war is that proximate, what you've got to be doing is making plans for the mobilization of the entire state and making sure that it's not just your defence spending that is increasing, it's how you invest in the infrastructure that mobilizes your armed forces. It's how you harden your infrastructure so that you're a harder target to beat and you're more resilient. It's how you develop the health services that not only meet the needs of the nation in wartime, and how you stockpile medicines and resources to support that, but also, and this is a point that we were seized by 4 or 5 years ago when we were writing the last defence review, the UK military has a huge number of its medics working day in, day out in the NHS. And if you turned round to the health secretary, who is working really hard to bring down waiting lists within the NHS, and said, we need to pull all of those medics out because we have to get into the business of training for and being ready for war fighting, the political imperative is around reducing NHS waiting lists, not being resilient and ready.
The manifesto promise.
Yeah, and look, and so I think you and I are in vigorous agreement that strategic resilience is actually the foundation on which conventional and strategic deterrence is based. You can have you can have as big armed forces as you like, you can have all the nuclear weapons that you like, but if your homeland
Yeah.
is not ready and is easily taken out of the fight, then you're done for within the first couple of days. Robert, time is galloping away from us. I just wanted to quickly pick your brain on Iran. I know that you've got some real expertise in the area. Iran has gone from being the thing that everybody was very, very, very worried about over the last sort of 12 months or so, as the situation in Gaza was developing and contagion into the wider region. Since January, attention has been elsewhere. But I think you're very nervous that there's still acute danger in the region.
I think there is a general perception, and it is a question mark rather than a known fact, that they think they're getting very close to serious weaponization in the nuclear program. And hence we have a Trump letter to the Supreme Leader and the leadership saying we have got to do some sort of deal on nuclear, forget about the JCPOA, the agreement of 2015-2016. We've got to do something about it, or we will have to react. I'm sorry to say, that you just have to look. There are 3 carrier groups in the region. There's the French carrier group there. They've moved B-2 bombers to Guam. It's extremely worrying, and I think quite rightly, we've seen the Houthis in a way as a symptom, an outlier of this very, very grave problem, which is developing. I think it's so grave. It's very, very interesting. I'm sorry to go back to my favourite pronouncement by Sherlock Holmes. There's nothing so deceptive as an obvious fact. This obvious build-up is going on. Very few people are writing about it. I have 1 or 2 correspondents who almost phone me on a daily basis. Said, have you seen the move up? What's going on? What is the pressure? There's been no response from the Ayatollah. And unfortunately, from the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, there was rather an ominous pronouncement. I thought that, with the destruction of Israel because of the troubles over Gaza and the Houthis and so on. No, well, our aim is to destroy the United States, he was saying, only in the last few weeks. So that is very worrying. I think, by the way, can I just say a quick observation about the Defence Review and so on? The big question is the R word, the resilience word, which we can't do, and you will have seen it in government. Resilience means redundancy and contingency as well. And and that's what we've had with stocks, military stocks. The other area, which people, you and I know very well, are very much addressed to, is actually modernizing and making more effective the volunteer sector. And that's where people like Dr. Fiona Hill and particularly Professor Paul Collier at Oxford, the development economist, saying it's absolutely essential to make the whole thing work. And it's the outreach and the outlie from the Defence Review which may be more important than the review itself.
When do you think we're going to see the UK Defence Review, Robert?
Oh, I thought it was going to come with an Easter bunny. I think George Robertson, who did give a little giveaway, a little discussion we had at the French embassy 2 weeks ago, that he thinks it's the implications, the inferences, he thinks it was really going to frighten the horses, and it's certainly frightening the government, because he said, in the terms in which we see it, we're actually on the threshold of, but in terms of cyber, communications and so on, we are at war. And that's not a proposition that any government right now wants to give the great British people.
I agree. I mean, I've had this conversation with a number of the ministers within the MOD now. There's no right or wrong way to do a defence review. If you manage it internally and the ministers give a bit of sort of opening guidance around where they would like it to go, that means that the review is from the outset founded in the political realities of the government of the day, but it can limit thinking and therefore be less imaginative, less disruptive. But if you hand it across to an external independent team,
which they've done,
eventually those recommendations, whilst they will not be bounded by politics, and that's in many ways a good thing. I'd be fascinated to read the original,
Yeah.
sort of edited version of the review, but eventually it collides with politics, and
Yes.
that is it's easy for defence and security wonks like you and I to say there is nothing more important, but when you are in the Treasury or in the political team in Number 10, you know, the fact is that people are more motivated to vote around NHS waiting times than they are the size of the Royal Navy. So I'm not surprised to see an independent review take so long to work its way through the political processes in government. What I'd be interested to see, and maybe you've got some insight into this, is if the politics demand that the recommendations are watered down as much as some say they will need to be, whether or not the review team breaks ranks and say this isn't our work, we don't stand by it.
I think you're quite right. Alpha particles, let's get to nuclear physics here. I think there's some fissile material in this, but particularly in the thinking of two that I know best over the years, Richard Barrons and Fiona Hill. And they take no prisoners. And I think from what George Robertson was saying, he was absolutely clear. They have done what they were asked to do, an independent panel. And I think one of the most interesting things from what he was saying, they had very good intelligence assessment access, and they have projected onto that what they think is where we're going and what we need to do. And I think that may not fit in too well with manifesto land.
We shall see. Robert, it has been an absolute joy talking to you. You have laid waste to the questions that I had planned, but I suspect that our audience will judge that where you've taken us has been infinitely more fascinating than the stuff that I was going to ask you. It has been a brilliant conversation. You have an incredible mind. I remember sitting next to you at dinner a few years ago and being slightly intimidated because you had seen many, many ministers come and go. And you were telling me about your reporting in the Falklands at the very beginning of your journalistic career. And it is an absolute treat to have someone with your encyclopedic knowledge of defence and your experiences on the front line on superpowers to help us understand the way that the world is going. Robert, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've been watching Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. Tune in for more episodes of Superpowers and also subscribe to the Times Radio channel for all of the amazing geopolitical content that is produced, not just on Superpowers, but all the other shows produced on this channel. All of them help to bring a little bit of clarity to a world that is ever more uncertain and seems to be changing every hour. Until next week, thank you very much. Goodbye.